Aves, one of the many majesties of our world. These flying, feather-bearing beauties have soared the heavens for centuries, ever the sight to look up at. And for equally long, they've infiltrated the hearts of so many of humanity's most powerful fictions, as symbols of our deepest truths. Young love in Rio, childlike wonder in Happy Feet, the valiant trial of heroes in the super underrated visually iconic Legend of the Guardians of the Owls of Ga'Hoole directed by Zack Snyder, which you should totally watch. Unbridled fury in Angry Birds, the dystopian hellscape in Birdemic, and the birds. But one of the most interesting of them all has to be...
You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody.
Yep, we're doing this. We're doing this with a movie about people fighting over boxes. Don't worry, it'll make sense, I promise. For now, you should know that On the Waterfront is a crime drama directed by All-American auteur Elia Kazan, starring Marlon Brando Jr. as anti-hero Terry Mallow. By day, a Hoboken dock worker, by night a member of that dock's resident oppressive, corrupt labor union, which he reluctantly helps expose after discovering that the victim of their latest cover-up crime is the brother of... Oh, Eva Marie Saint. Yeah, that makes sense. What was I saying? He also teams up with an alarmingly suave priest. The movie was based on a true story, yes, including the priest part, about a similar waterfront crime ordeal in the early 50s, which originally came to light after being investigated by the Sun reporter Malcolm Johnson. The New York Times describes the situation.
The investigation of conditions on the New York waterfront had its origins in a relatively minor story, the murder of a dock worker's hiring boss in April of 1948. Mr. Johnson covered the story. Then, he undertook a more thorough study that grew into a 6-month task of legwork.
The story, in all truth, snowballed. One lead led to another. Various sources and contracts were developed, but only after months of hard digging. Several times I was almost ready to give up, convinced that the real story would never be uncovered. Then I had some lucky breaks. One was meeting and gaining the confidence of an informant, an ex-convict who had worked with the racketeers. His story set the pattern and steered me to others.
The story was so rich in drama and conspiracy that it ended up spawning a novel, and eventually a script for a movie, tentatively titled The Hook, which itself saw a bit of drama across its iterations. The story was first written by Arthur Miller, playwright and friend of Kazan, who got into a disagreement with a producer, Harry Cohn, over an attempt to change the movie's antagonists into communists, an unsurprising mandate given the backdrop of McCarthyism on which this all took place, and in which Kazan was directly involved, having outed 8 communists in the film industry to the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HWAC. Wait, what? This had in fact only heightened tensions between the director and writer and placed no shortage of critical heat on Kazan, who was seen in many circles as a traitor, much like someone else I know of. But he remained unapologetic about what he considered doing his due diligence to repel a force of evil from a field he held dear. The debacle would end in Miller's replacement by Bud Schulberg, and the film would gradually materialize into Kazan's own formal middle finger to his detractors, which would later be adorned with 12 Oscar nominations, 8 wins, and permanent classic status, entailing the immortalization of lines which would find their way into even the openings of student projects 6+ decades in the future. So, how did any of this context manifest in the movie itself? If only there were some inside source we could consult, some gateway into the mind of the creator, some way to peruse his soul for answer. Oh yeah, interview.
Well, when I was in college, I had a great problem, which was I wanted to avoid going into business. I didn't want to work in the way that my father was working, or most people worked, and I was looking for some way of living that was my own. And I saw the great Russian pictures of the 20s, Dovzhenko, Eisenstein, Pudovkin, and those films, and they were an inspiration to me. I've never forgotten them. I've never been influenced by anything else in my life. I made up my mind when I was 18 or so to try to become a film director, and I've never wanted to do anything else. I've always appreciated the specific nature of the motion picture art. I've never thought that it was like the stage. The means of telling a story in films is entirely different than that on the stage. I've not wanted to make the movies more like the theater, but rather less like so. And the more films I make, the more I feel that films are one thing and the theater is something entirely different. And as I develop in films, I try to make my films more increasingly pictorial. And when I work in the theater, that is a different craft, a different medium. I do not want to bring them together.
Kazan utilizes film's predominantly visual character to convey a theme of our protagonist engulfed in a world of darkness, most notably by styling the picture in black and white, despite the technology of the time well allowing otherwise. The effect of this is clear. From the opening scene, with blacks crushed to the point of near invisibility, we see that Terry is being held captive, as seen by his being framed quite literally with spikes to his neck. Nearly every nighttime set is lit as a grotesque, horror-esque corridor or back alley. At any given time, it feels like the characters are somewhere they shouldn't be, and that danger is looming. And danger is looming. After the cover-up murder of Joey Doyle, we see this mood reflected in a town bereft of hope. The entire crime scene crowd is so eerily expressionless after having seen a decent man thrown off of a roof. Even Joey's father can barely muster more than a look of disappointment. It isn't a lack of sympathy they're showing, nor a lack of care. It's evident that they just don't have the heart to feign surprise at this sort of thing. This is not their first rodeo. Whatever is holding these people underneath its boot has done a number on them. Enter Johnny Friendly, who is anything but. Johnny is our waterfront kingpin, head of the labor union, and he's as hard as they come.
Fight. There's nobody tough anymore.
Johnny, as we quickly see, is the product of a savagery that grossly predates him, but which he plays no small part in contributing to. Having tasted the sour fruits of malevolent society, rather than standing up to injustice, he merely became it. He is the new despot in town, as well as a sort of perverted father figure for Terry, and the embodiment of the negative force acting on him. Terry can have anything he wants, given that he never endangers the operation over some petty sentiment. But be that as it may, Terry can't hide his abhorrence worth a damn, because he's the only one with any compunction. Now, this is a good opportunity to point out that it wouldn't be possible to convey any of this nearly as subtly as is done without the nuance of Marlon Brando's innovative acting style, which radically departed from the heightened riffs and mannerisms of the traditional film acting of that day in favor of a fully fledged attempt at realism. We actually see him being torn, and that fact constitutes a huge portion of the reason why his scenes work. When we look at him, we see that he doesn't belong. Likewise, in a later church meeting in which a few concerned citizens gather in solidarity for Joey, all eyes are distrustingly on Terry because of his alliances, even though he could easily turn the tide of the war on the waterfront by cooperating with the authorities or being a pigeon.
How do you like them? Mugs taking me for a pigeon.
He isn't quite ready to be virtuous, and thus, he doesn't belong there either. So Terry finds sanctuary in purgatory, the pigeon coop. Why? Because the pigeons are aloof, but more importantly, they're innocent. Perhaps the only innocent beings in the town, and certainly the only ones that he's at liberty to show compassion to. Partly because, well, he can relate to being caged. I'm sensing a pattern. A man putting his livelihood on the line in the name of virtue when remaining quiet would be the most expedient choice. This is a dynamic all too familiar to Kazan. Subtle it may not be, but subtlety has no place on this waterfront. We see at every turn, from the camera work emphasizing the smallness and crampedness of the town, to the dialogue between citizens implying an endless common history, that everyone here knows each other. Everyone knows that they work for murderers and thieves. Yet no one dares to sacrifice their anonymity and confront the corruption for fear of personal sacrifice. Because after all, it just ain't worth it.
Conscious. That stuff can drive you nuts.
Enter Edie, the conscience, the positive force, the embodiment of unconditional love, charity, and slightly naive optimism. Yes, she's idealistic, but she also manages to stay that way after the pointless murder of her brother. Edie's virtuosity and Terry's weary cynicism go head-to-head in a duel of the fates during a bar scene.
What do you really care, am I right?
Shouldn't everybody care about everybody else?
Well, what a fruitcake you are.
I mean, isn't everybody a part of everybody else?
And you really believe that, Drew? Hey, you want to my philosophy of life? Do it to him before he does it to you.
There's not a spark of sentiment or romance or human kindness in your whole body.
What good does it do you besides get you in trouble? Listen, down here, it's every man for himself. It's keeping alive. It's standing in with the right people so you get a little bit of change jingling in your pocket.
And if you don't?
If you don't, write down.
Terry puts on a good show, but he all but concedes when he shows his moral impotence when he can't console Edie in any other way than, well.
Here, come on, have a little beer. Come on.
Still though, this scene is important because it establishes an important dynamic. Terry has seen more. He has life on his side. Edie has the right idea, but she's still naive. This conflict needs a mediator, and we have one.
Be careful, don't spill no water on the floor, because I don't want them to catch cold.
It's possible not to notice, but throughout the film, Terry and ancillary characters repeatedly give pigeons a hell of a time of it. They use them as bait to commit crimes.
Hey, I got one of your birds!
They use their namesake in vain. Now, this sort of insult contradicts Terry's warmth towards the birds, as well as his treatment of their coops as a refuge. Very much in the same vein as he denies and represses how much of a little teddy bear how greatly he's considering turning his life around for Edie. The birds are the perfect symbolic mediator, primarily because, unlike Edie, the birds aren't inexperienced. In fact, compared to humanity, they're eternal. They've stood the evolutionary test of time while still exhibiting so much of what Terry considers sentimental drivel.
You know, one thing about them, though, they're very faithful. They get married just like people.
Berta.
See, he does get it. Either way, seeing as birds are incapable of English, mostly, it seems that this conflict between Terry and Edie will have to be literally mediated by the real hero of the story, Father Barry. Father Barry is many things. He's a good man who acts virtuously despite the personal convenience or inconvenience of doing so, and a man who doesn't pretend to be purer than his milieu. He's human. He smokes, drinks. He's not innocent, at least, not in the way that correlates to ignorance. He's simply good.
And every time the mob puts the pressure on a good man, tries to stop him from doing his duty as a citizen, it's a crucifixion.
He lives in the same world as those he implores to do better. The birds, and Father Barry, represent the enlightened transcendence of cynicism. So, what must happen for one to transcend cynicism?
You're going down there.
Terry decides to testify against Johnny Friendly and his union after the tragic, yet predictable, death of his brother. And even after this lawful retaliation, Terry is despondent. He hasn't won, not really. Something still needs to happen. The structure of the film and the state of the character dictate it. Terry needs to be pushed by one more event. And the bastards did it.
Kid. What do you have to do that for? Every one of them.
They brought their war to his sanctuary. They killed his brother, but that didn't send him over the edge. It wasn't until they shed totally, actually innocent blood, the blood of something that deserves to be avenged, that Terry was motivated to win morally.
You ratted on us, Terry.
From where you stand, maybe, but I'm standing over here now. I was ratting on myself all them years, I didn't even know it.
He confronts the corruption head on, but he still hasn't gained the support of the collective. It isn't until Terry loses and gets back up that world joins man. The movie can be seen in a surprisingly uplifting light if you view it as Kazan's honest love letter to America. It's brutal, sure, but not hopeless. It's filled with dark corners, but in those corners lie good people who can be spurred by example to make change. The example of someone who, though as imperfect as the world around him, is willing to die for worthy values of decency. It's a moral landscape that transcends politics, and that couldn't be better represented than by the vestiges of innocence that move our decent person to make that change. Our feathered friends, our birds on the waterfront.